Chapter 3 of Trent's Last Case. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Trent's Last Case, Chapter 3. Handcuffs in the Air. A painter, and the son of a painter, Philip Trent had, while yet in his 20s, achieved some reputation within the world of English art. Moreover, his pictures sold. An original, forcible talent, and a habit of leisurely but continuous working, broken by fits of strong creative enthusiasm, were at the bottom of it. His father's name had helped. A patrimony large enough to relieve him of the perilous imputation of being a struggling man had certainly not hindered, but his best aid to success had been an unconscious power of getting himself liked. Good spirits and a lively, humorous fancy will always be popular. Trent joined to these a genuine interest in others that gained him something deeper than popularity. His judgment of persons was penetrating, but its process was internal. No one felt on good behavior with a man who seemed always to be enjoying himself. Whether he was in a mood for floods of nonsense or applying himself vigorously to a task, his face seldom lost its expression of contained vivacity. Apart from a sound knowledge of his art and its history, his culture was large and loose, dominated by a love of poetry. At 32 he had not yet passed the age of laughter and adventure. His rise to a celebrity 100 times greater than his proper work had won for him came of a momentary impulse. One day he had taken up a newspaper to find it chiefly concerned with a crime of a sort curiously rare in our country, a murder done in a railway train. The circumstances were puzzling. 2 persons were under arrest upon suspicion. Trent, to whom an interest in such affairs was a new sensation, heard the thing discussed among his friends, and set himself in a purposeless mood to read up the accounts given in several journals. He became intrigued. His imagination began to work, in a manner strange to him, upon facts. An excitement took hold of him, such as he had only known before in his bursts of art inspiration or of personal adventure. At the end of the day he wrote and despatched a long letter to the editor of the Record, which he chose only because it had contained the fullest and most intelligent version of the facts. In this letter he did very much what Poe had done in the case of the murder of Mary Rogers. With nothing but the newspapers to guide him, he drew attention to the significance of certain apparently negligible facts, and ranged the evidence in such a manner as to throw grave suspicion upon a man who had presented himself as a witness. Sir James Molloy had printed this letter in leaded type. The same evening he was able to announce in the Sun the arrest and full confession of the incriminated man. Sir James, who knew all the worlds of London, had lost no time in making Trent's acquaintance. The 2 men got on well, for Trent possessed some secret of native tact which had the effect of almost abolishing differences of age between himself and others. The great rotary presses in the basement of the Record building had filled him with a new enthusiasm. He had painted there, and Sir James had bought at sight what he called a machinery-scape in the manner of Heinrich Clay. Then a few months later came the affair known as the Ilkeley mystery. Sir James had invited Trent to an emollient dinner, and thereafter offered him what seemed to the young man a fantastically large sum for his temporary services as special representative of the Record at Ilkeley. "You could do it," the editor had urged. "You can write good stuff, and you know how to talk to people, and I can teach you all the technicalities of a reporter's job in half an hour. And you have a head for mystery, you have imagination and cool judgment along with it. Think how it would feel if you pulled it off." Trent had to admit that it would be rather a lark. He had smoked, frowned, and at last convinced himself that the only thing that held him back was fear of an unfamiliar task. To react against fear had become a fixed moral habit with him, and he had accepted Sir James's offer. He had pulled it off. For the second time he had given the authorities a start and a beating, and his name was on all tongues. He withdrew and painted pictures. He felt no leaning toward journalism, and Sir James, who knew a good deal about art, honourably refrained, as other editors did not, from tempting him with a good salary. But in the course of a few years he had applied to him perhaps 30 times for his services in the unravelling of similar problems at home and abroad. Sometimes Trent, busy with work that held him, had refused. Sometimes he had been forestalled in the discovery of the truth. But the result of his irregular connection with the Record had been to make his name one of the best known in England. It was characteristic of him that his name was almost the only detail of his personality known to the public. He had imposed absolute silence about himself upon the Malloy papers, and the others were not going to advertise one of Sir James's men. The Manderson case, he told himself as he walked rapidly up the sloping road to White Gables, might turn out to be terribly simple. Cupples was a wise old boy, but it was probably impossible for him to have an impartial opinion about his niece. Yet it was true that the manager of the hotel, who had spoken of her beauty in terms that aroused his attention, had spoken even more emphatically of her goodness. Not an artist in words, the manager had yet conveyed a very definite idea to Trent's mind. "There isn't a child about here that don't brighten up at the sound of her voice," he had said, "nor yet a grown-up for the matter of that. Everybody used to look forward to her coming over in the summer. I don't mean that she's one of these women that are all kind heart and nothing else. There's backbone with it, if you know what I mean, pluck, any amount of go. There's nobody in Marlstone that isn't sorry for the lady in her trouble, not but what some of us may think she's lucky at the last of it." Trent wanted very much to meet Mrs. Manderson. He could see now, beyond a spacious lawn and shrubbery, the front of the 2-storied house of dull red brick, with the pair of great gables from which it had its name. He had had but a glimpse of it from the car that morning. A modern house, he saw, perhaps 10 years old. The place was beautifully kept, with that air of opulent peace that clothes even the smallest houses of the well-to-do in an English countryside. Before it, beyond the road, the rich meadowland ran down to the edge of the cliffs. Behind it a woody landscape stretched away across a broad vale to the moors. That such a place could be the scene of a crime of violence seemed fantastic. It lay so quiet and well ordered, so eloquent of disciplined service and gentle living. Yet there beyond the house, and near the hedge that rose between the garden and the hot, white road, stood the gardener's tool shed, by which the body had been found, lying tumbled against the wooden wall. Trent walked past the gate of the drive and along the road until he was opposite this shed. Some 40 yards further along, the road turned sharply away from the house, to run between thick plantations, and just before this turn the grounds of the house ended, with a small white gate at the angle of the boundary hedge. He approached this gate, which was plainly for the use of gardeners and the service of the establishment. It swung easily on its hinges, and he passed slowly up a path that led toward the back of the house, between the outer hedge and a tall wall of rhododendrons. Through a gap in this wall a track led him to the little neatly built erection of wood which stood among trees that faced a corner of the front. The body had lain on the side away from the house. A servant, he thought, looking out of the nearer windows in the earlier hours of the day before, might have glanced unseeing at the hut, as she wondered what it could be like to be as rich as Manderson. He examined the place carefully, and ransacked the hut within, but he could note no more than the trodden appearance of the uncut grass where the body had lain. Crouching low, with keen eyes and feeling fingers, he searched the ground minutely over a wide area, but the search was fruitless. It was interrupted by the sound, the first he had heard from the house, of the closing of the front door. Trent unbent his long legs and stepped to the edge of the drive. A man was walking quickly away from the house in the direction of the great gate. At the noise of a footstep on the gravel, the man wheeled with nervous swiftness and looked earnestly at Trent. The sudden sight of his face was almost terrible, so white and worn it was. Yet it was a young man's face. There was not a wrinkle about the haggard blue eyes, for all their tale of strain and desperate fatigue. As the two approached each other, Trent noted with admiration the man's breadth of shoulder and lithe, strong figure. In his carriage, inelastic as weariness had made it, in his handsome, regular features, in his short, smooth yellow hair, and in his voice as he addressed Trent, the influence of a special sort of training was confessed. "Oxford was your playground, I think, my young friend," said Trent to himself. "If you are Mr. Trent," said the young man pleasantly, "you are expected. Mr. Cupples 'phoned from the hotel. My name is Marlowe." "You were secretary to Mr. Manderson, I believe," said Trent. He was much inclined to like young Marlowe. Though he seemed so near a physical breakdown, he gave out none the less that air of clean living and inward health that is the peculiar glory of his social type at his years. But there was something in the tired eyes that was a challenge to Trent's penetration, an habitual expression, as he took it to be, of meditating and weighing things not present to their sight. It was a look too intelligent, too steady and purposeful to be called dreamy. Trent thought he had seen such a look before somewhere. He went on to say: "It is a terrible business for you all. I fear it has upset you completely, Mr. Marlowe." "A little limp, that's all," replied the young man wearily. "I was driving the car all Sunday night and most of yesterday, and I didn't sleep last night after hearing the news. Who would? But I have an appointment now, Mr. Trent, down at the doctor's, arranging about the inquest. I expect it'll be to-morrow. If you will go up to the house and ask for Mr. Bunner, you'll find him expecting you. He will tell you all about things and show you round. He's the other secretary, an American, and the best of fellows. He'll look after you. There's a detective here, by the way, Inspector Murch, from Scotland Yard. He came yesterday." "Murch!" Trent exclaimed. "But he and I are old friends. How under the sun did he get here so soon?" "I have no idea," Mr. Marlowe answered. "But he was here last evening, before I got back from Southampton, interviewing everybody, and he's been about here since 8 this morning. He's in the library now. That's where the open French window is that you see at the end of the house there. Perhaps you would like to step down there and talk about things?" "I think I will," said Trent. Mr. Marlowe nodded and went on his way. The thick turf of the lawn, round which the drive took its circular sweep, made Trent's footsteps as noiseless as a cat's. In a few moments he was looking in through the open leaves of the window at the southward end of the house, considering with a smile a very broad back and bent head covered with short grizzled hair. The man within was stooping over a number of papers laid out on the table. "'Twas ever thus," said Trent in a melancholy tone, at the first sound of which the man within turned round with startling swiftness. "From childhood's hour I've seen my fondest hopes decay. I did think I was ahead of Scotland Yard this time, and now here is the largest officer in the entire metropolitan force already occupying the position." The detective smiled grimly and came to the window. "I was expecting you, Mr. Trent," he said. "This is the sort of case you like." "Since my tastes were being considered," Trent replied, stepping into the room, "I wish they had followed up the idea by keeping my hated rival out of the business. You have got a long start, too. I know all about it." His eyes began to wander around the room. "How did you manage it? You are a quick mover, I know. The dun deer's hide on fleeter foot was never tied. But I don't see how you got here in time to be at work yesterday evening. Has Scotland Yard secretly started an aviation corps? Or is it in league with the infernal powers? In either case the Home Secretary should be called upon to make a statement." "It's simpler than that," said Mr. Murch, with professional stolidity. "I happened to be on leave with the missus at Halvey, which is only 12 miles or so along the coast. As soon as our people there heard of the murder they told me. I wired to the chief and was put in charge of the case at once. I bicycled over yesterday evening and have been at it since then." "Arising out of that reply," said Trent inattentively, "how is Mrs. Inspector Murch?" "Never better, thank you," answered the inspector, "and frequently speaks of you and the games you used to have with our kids. But you'll excuse me saying, Mr. Trent, that you needn't trouble to talk your nonsense to me while you're using your eyes. I know your ways by now. I understand you've fallen on your feet as usual, and have the lady's permission to go over the place and make inquiries." "Such is the fact," said Trent. "I am going to cut you out again, Inspector. I owe you one for beating me over the Abinger case. You old fox! But if you really mean that you're not inclined for the social amenities just now, let us leave compliments and talk business." He stepped to the table, glanced through the papers arranged there in order, and then turned to the open roll-top desk. He looked into the drawer swiftly. "I see this has been cleared out. Well now, Inspector, I suppose we play the game as before." Trent had found himself on several occasions in the past thrown into the company of Inspector Murch, who stood high in the councils of the Criminal Investigation Department. He was a quiet, tactful, and very shrewd officer, a man of great courage, with a vivid history in connection with the more dangerous class of criminals. His humanity was as broad as his frame, which was large even for a policeman. Trent and he, through some obscure working of sympathy, had appreciated one another from the beginning, and had formed one of those curious friendships with which it was the younger man's delight to adorn his experience. The inspector would talk more freely to him than to anyone under the rose, and they would discuss details and possibilities of every case to their mutual enlightenment. There were necessarily rules and limits. It was understood between them that Trent made no journalistic use of any point that could only have come to him from an official source. Each of them, moreover, for the honor and prestige of the institution he represented, openly reserved the right to withhold from the other any discovery or inspiration that might come to him which he considered vital to the solution of the difficulty. Trent had insisted on carefully formulating these principles of what he called detective sportsmanship. Mr. Murch, who loved a contest, and who only stood to gain by his association with the keen intelligence of the other, entered very heartily into the game. In these strivings for the credit of the press and of the police, victory sometimes attended the experience and method of the officer, sometimes the quicker brain and livelier imagination of Trent, his gift of instinctively recognizing the significant through all disguises. The inspector, then, replied to Trent's last words with cordial agreement. Leaning on either side of the French window, with the deep peace and hazy splendor of the summer landscape before them, they reviewed the case. Trent had taken out a thin notebook, and as they talked he began to make, with light, sure touches, a rough sketch plan of the room. It was a thing he did habitually on such occasions, and often quite idly, but now and then the habit had served him to good purpose. This was a large, light apartment at the corner of the house, with generous window space in 2 walls. A broad table stood in the middle. As one entered by the window, the roll-top desk stood just to the left of it, against the wall. The inner door was in the wall to the left, at the farther end of the room, and was faced by a broad window divided into openings of the casement type. A beautifully carved old corner cupboard rose high against the wall beyond the door, and another cupboard filled a recess beside the fireplace. Some colored prints of Harunobu, with which Trent promised himself a better acquaintance, hung on what little wall space was unoccupied by books. These had a very uninspiring appearance of having been bought by the yard, and never taken from their shelves. Bound with a sober luxury, the great English novelists, essayists, historians, and poets stood ranged like an army stuck dead in its ranks. There were a few chairs made like the cupboard and table of old carved oak, a modern armchair, and a swivel office chair before the desk. The room looked costly but very bare. Almost the only portable objects were a great porcelain bowl of a wonderful blue on the table, a clock, and some cigar boxes on the mantel-shelf, and a movable telephone standard on the top of the desk. "Seen the body?" inquired the inspector. Trent nodded. "And the place where it lay," he said. "First impressions of this case rather puzzle me," said the inspector. "From what I heard at Halvey, I guessed it might be common robbery and murder by some tramp, though such a thing is very far from common in these parts. But as soon as I began my inquiries I came on some curious points, which by this time I dare say you've noted for yourself. The man is shot in his own grounds, quite near the house, to begin with. Yet there's not the slightest trace of any attempt at burglary. And the body wasn't robbed. In fact, it would be as plain a case of suicide as you could wish to see, if it weren't for certain facts. Here's another thing. For a month or so past they tell me Manderson had been in a queer state of mind. I expect you know already that he and his wife had some trouble between them. The servants had noticed a change in his manner to her for a long time, and for the past week he had scarcely spoken to her. They say he was a changed man, moody and silent. Whether on account of that or something else. The lady's maid says he looked as if something was going to arrive. It's always easy to remember that people looked like that after something has happened to them. Still, that's what they say. There you are again, then. Suicide. Now, why wasn't it suicide, Mr. Trent?" "The facts, so far as I know them, are really all against it," Trent replied, sitting on the threshold of the window and clasping his knees. "First, of course, no weapon is to be found. I've searched and you've searched, and there's no trace of any firearm anywhere within a stone's throw of where the body lay. Second, the marks on the wrists, flesh scratches and bruises, which we can only assume to have been done in a struggle with somebody. Third, who ever heard of a body shooting himself in the eye? Then I heard from the manager of the hotel here another fact which strikes me as the most curious detail in this affair. Manderson had dressed himself fully before going out there, but he forgot his false teeth. Now, how could a suicide who dressed himself to make a decent appearance as a corpse forget his teeth?" "That last argument hadn't struck me," admitted Mr. Murch. "There's something in it. But on the strength of the other points which had occurred to me, I am not considering suicide. I have been looking about for ideas in this house this morning. I expect you were thinking of doing the same thing." "That is so. It is a case for ideas, it seems to me." "Come, Murch, let us make an effort. Let us bend our spirits to a temper of general suspicion. Let us suspect everybody in the house, to begin with. Listen, I will tell you whom I suspect. I suspect Mrs. Manderson, of course. I also suspect both the secretaries. I hear there are two, and I hardly know which of them I regard as more thoroughly open to suspicion. I suspect the butler and the lady's maid. I suspect the other domestics, and especially do I suspect the boot boy. By the way, what domestics are there? I have more than enough suspicion to go around, whatever the size of the establishment, but as a matter of curiosity I should like to know." "All very well to laugh," replied the inspector, "but at the first stage of affairs it's the only safe principle, and you know that as well as I do, Mr. Trent. However, I've seen enough of the people here, last night and to-day, to put a few of them out of my mind, for the present at least. You will form your own conclusions. As for the establishment, there's the butler and lady's maid, cook and 3 other maids, one a young girl, one chauffeur who's gone away with a broken wrist, no boy. What about the gardener? You say nothing about that shadowy and sinister figure, the gardener. You are keeping him in the background, Murch. Out with him." "The garden is attended to by a man in the village who comes twice a week. I've talked to him. He was here last on Friday." "Then I suspect him all the more," said Trent. "And now as to the house itself. What I propose to do, to begin with, is to sniff about a little in this room where I am told Manderson spent a great deal of his time, and in his bedroom, especially the bedroom. But since we are in this room, let's start here. You seem to be at the same stage of the inquiry. Perhaps you've done the bedroom already?" The inspector nodded. "I've been through Manderson's and his wife's. Nothing's to be got there, I think. Very simple and bare. No signs of any sort that I could see. Seems to have insisted on the simple life, does Manderson. Never employed a valet. The room's almost like a cell, except for the clothes and shoes. You'll find it all exactly as I found it, and they tell me that's exactly as Manderson left it, at we don't know what o'clock, yesterday morning. Opens into Mrs. Manderson's bedroom. Not much of the cell about that, I can tell you. I should say the lady was as fond of pretty things as most. But she cleared out of it on the morning of the discovery. Told the maid she could never sleep in a room opening into her murdered husband's room. Very natural feeling in a woman, Mr. Trent. She's camping out, so to say, in one of the spare bedrooms now." "Come, my friend," Trent was saying to himself as he made a few notes in his little book, "have you got your eye on Mrs. Manderson, or haven't you? I know that colorless tone of the inspectorial voice. I wish I had seen her. Either you've got something against her and you don't want me to get hold of it, or else you've made up your mind she's innocent, but have no objection to my wasting my time over her. Well, it's all in the game, which begins to look extremely interesting as we go on." To Mr. Murch he said aloud, "Well, I'll draw the bedroom later on. What about this?" "They call it the library," said the inspector. "Manderson used to do his writing and that in here, passed most of the time he spent indoors here. Since he and his wife ceased to hit it off together, he had taken to spending his evenings alone, and when at this house he always spent 'em in here. He was last seen alive, as far as the servants are concerned, in this room." Trent rose and glanced again through the papers set out upon the table. "Business letters and documents mostly," said Mr. Murch. "Reports, prospectuses, and that. A few letters on private matters, nothing in them that I can see. The American secretary, Bunner is his name, and a queerer card I never saw turned. He's been through this desk with me this morning. He had got it into his head that Manderson had been receiving threatening letters, and that murder was the outcome of that. But there's no trace of any such thing, and we have looked at every blessed paper. The only unusual things we found were some packets of bank notes to a very considerable amount, and a couple of little bags of unset diamonds. I asked Bunner to put them in a safer place. It appears that Manderson had begun buying diamonds lately as speculation. It was a new game to him, the secretary said, and it seemed to amuse him. "What about those secretaries?" Trent inquired. "I met one called Marlowe just now outside. A nice-looking chap with singular eyes, unquestionably English. The other, it seems, is an American. What did Manderson want with an English secretary?" Mr. Marlowe explained to me how that was. The American was his right-hand business man, one of his office staff who never left him. Mr. Marlowe had nothing to do with Manderson's business as a financier, knew nothing of it. His job was to look after Manderson's horses and motors and yacht and sporting arrangements and that. Make himself generally useful, as you might say. He had the spending of a lot of money, I should think. The other was confined entirely to the office affairs, and I dare say he had his hands full. As for his being English, it was just a fad of Manderson's to have an English secretary. He'd had several before Mr. Marlowe. "He showed his taste," observed Trent. "It might be more than interesting, don't you think, to be minister to the pleasures of a modern plutocrat with a large P? Only they say that Mandersons were exclusively of an innocent kind. Certainly Marlowe gives me the impression that he would be weak in the part of Petronius. But to return to the matter in hand," he looked at his notes, "you said just now that he was last seen alive here, so far as the servants were concerned. That meant—" "He had a conversation with his wife on going to bed. But for that, the manservant, Martin by name, last saw him in his room. I had his story last night, and very glad he was to tell it. An affair like this is meat and drink to the servants of the house." Trent considered for some moments, gazing through the open window over the sun-flooded slopes. "Would it bore you to hear what he has to say again?" he asked at length. For reply Mr. Murch rang the bell. A spare, clean-shaven, middle-aged man, having the servant's manner in its most distinguished form, answered it. "This is Mr. Trent, who is authorized by Mrs. Manderson to go over the house and make inquiries," explained the detective. "He would like to hear your story." Martin bowed distantly. He recognized Trent for a gentleman. Time would show whether he was what Martin called a gentleman in every sense of the word. "I observed you approaching the house, sir," said Martin, with impassive courtesy. He spoke with a slow and measured utterance. "My instructions are to assist you in every possible way. Should you wish me to recall the circumstances of Sunday night?" "Please," said Trent, with ponderous gravity. Martin's style was making clamorous appeal to his sense of comedy. He banished with an effort all vivacity of expression from his face. "I last saw Mr. Manderson—" "No, not that yet," Trent checked him quietly. "Tell me all you saw of him that evening, after dinner, say. Try to recollect every little detail." "After dinner, sir? Yes. I remember that after dinner Mr. Manderson and Mr. Marlowe walked up and down the path through the orchard, talking. If you ask me for details, it struck me they were talking about something important, because I heard Mr. Manderson say something when they came in through the back entrance. He said, as near as I can remember, 'If Harris is there, every minute is of importance. You want to start right away, and not a word to a soul.'" Mr. Marlowe answered, "Very well. I will just change out of these clothes, and then I'm ready," or words to that effect. I heard this plainly as they passed the window of my pantry. And then Mr. Marlowe went up to his bedroom, and Mr. Manderson entered the library and rang for me. He handed me some letters for the postman in the morning, and directed me to sit up, as Mr. Marlowe had persuaded him to go for a drive in the car by moonlight. "That was curious," remarked Trent. "I thought so, sir, but I recollected what I had heard about 'not a word to a soul,' and I concluded that this about a moonlight drive was intended to mislead." "What time was this?" "It would be about 10, sir, I should say. After speaking to me, Mr. Manderson waited until Mr. Marlowe had come down and brought round the car. He then went into the drawing-room where Mrs. Manderson was." "Did that strike you as curious?" Martin looked down his nose. "If you ask me the question, sir," he said with reserve, "I had not known him to enter that room since we came here this year. He preferred to sit in the library in the evenings. That evening he only remained with Mrs. Manderson for a few minutes. Then he and Mr. Marlowe started immediately." "You saw them start?" "Yes, sir. They took the direction of Bishopsbridge." "And you saw Mr. Manderson again later?" "After an hour or thereabouts, sir, in the library. That would have been about 11:15, I should say." I had noticed 11 striking from the church. I may say I am peculiarly quick of hearing, sir. "Mr. Manderson had rung the bell for you, I suppose, yes? And what passed when you answered it?" "Mr. Manderson had put out the decanter of whisky and a siphon of glass, sir, from the cupboard where he kept them." Trent held up his hand. "While we are on that point, Martin, I want to ask you plainly, did Mr. Manderson drink very much? You understand this is not impertinent curiosity on my part. I want you to tell me because it may possibly help in the clearing up of this case." "Perfectly, sir," replied Martin gravely. "I have no hesitation in telling you what I have already told the inspector. Mr. Manderson was, considering his position in life, a remarkably abstemious man. In my 4 years of service with him I never knew anything of an alcoholic nature pass his lips except a glass or two of wine at dinner, very rarely a little at luncheon, and from time to time a whisky and soda before going to bed. He never seemed to form a habit of it. Often I used to find his glass in the morning with only a little soda water in it. Sometimes he would have been having whisky with it, but never much. He never was particular about his drinks. Ordinary soda was what he preferred, though I had ventured to suggest some of the natural minerals, having personally acquired a taste for them in my previous service. He used to keep them in the cupboard here because he had a great dislike of being waited on more than was necessary. It was an understood thing that I never came near him after dinner unless sent for. And when he sent for anything he liked it brought quick, and to be left alone again at once. He hated to be asked if he required anything more. Amazingly simple in his tastes, sir, Mr. Manderson was." "Very well. And he rang for you that night about 11:15. Now can you remember exactly what he said?" "I think I can tell you with some approach to accuracy, sir. It was not much. First he asked me if Mr. Bunner had gone to bed, and I replied that he had been gone up some time. He then said that he wanted some one to sit up until 12:30, in case an important message should come by telephone, and that Mr. Marlowe having gone to Southampton for him in his motor, he wished me to do this. That I was to take down the message if it came, and not disturb him. He also ordered a fresh siphon of soda water. I believe that was all, sir." "You noticed nothing unusual about him, I suppose?" "No, sir, nothing unusual. When I answered the ring he was seated at the desk, listening at the telephone, waiting for a number, as I supposed. He gave his orders and went on listening at the same time. When I returned with the siphon he was engaged in conversation over the wire." "Do you remember anything of what he was saying?" "Very little, sir. It was something about somebody being at some hotel, of no interest to me. I was only in the room just time enough to place the siphon on the table and withdraw. As I closed the door he was saying, 'You're sure he isn't in the hotel?' or words to that effect." "And that was the last time you saw and heard of him alive?" "No, sir. A little later, At 11:30, when I had settled down in my pantry with the door ajar and a book to pass the time, I heard Mr. Manderson go upstairs to bed. I immediately went to close the library window and slipped the lock of the front door. I did not hear anything more." Trent considered. "I suppose you didn't doze at all," he said tentatively, "while you were sitting up waiting for the telephone message?" "Oh, no, sir. I am always very wakeful about that time. I'm a bad sleeper, especially in the neighborhood of the sea, and I generally read in bed until somewhere about midnight." "And did any message come?" "No, sir." "No. And I suppose you sleep with your window open these warm nights?" "It is never closed at night, sir." Trent added a last note. Then he looked thoughtfully through those he had taken. He rose and paced up and down the room for some moments with a downcast eye. At length he paused opposite Martin. "It all seems perfectly ordinary and simple," he said. "I just want to get a few details clear. You went to shut the windows in the library before going to bed. Which windows?" "The French window, sir. It had been open all day. The windows opposite the door were seldom opened." "And what about the curtains? I am wondering whether anyone outside the house could have seen into the room." "Easily, sir, I should say, if he had got into the grounds on that side. The curtains were never drawn in the hot weather. Mr. Manderson would often sit right in the doorway at nights, smoking and looking out into the darkness. But nobody could have seen him who had any business to be there." "I see. And now tell me this. Your hearing is very acute, you say, and you heard Mr. Manderson enter the house when he came in after dinner from the garden. Did you hear him re-enter it after returning from the motor drive?" Martin paused. "Now you mention it, sir, I remember that I did not. His ringing the bell in this room was the first I knew of his being back. I should have heard him come in if he had come in by the front door. I should have heard the door go. But he must have come in by the window." The man reflected for a moment and then added, "As a general rule Mr. Manderson would come up by the front, hanging up his hat and coat in the hall, and pass down the hall into the study. It seems likely to me that he was in a great hurry to use the telephone, and so went straight across the lawn to the window. He was like that, sir, when there was anything important to be done. He had on his hat, now I remember, and had thrown his greatcoat over the end of the table. He gave his order very sharp, too, as he always did when busy. A very precipitate man indeed was Mr. Manderson. A hustler, as they say." "Ah! He appeared to be busy. But didn't you say just now that you noticed nothing unusual about him?" A melancholy smile flitted momentarily over Martin's face. "That observation shows that you did not know Mr. Manderson, sir, if you will pardon my saying so. His being like that was nothing unusual. Quite the contrary. It took me long enough to get used to it. Either he would be sitting quite still and smoking a cigar, thinking or reading, or else he would be writing, dictating, and sending off wires all at the same time, till it almost made one dizzy to see it, sometimes for an hour or more at a stretch. As for being in a hurry over a telephone message, I may say it wasn't in him to be anything else." Trent turned to the inspector, who met his eye with a look of answering intelligence. Not sorry to show his understanding of the line of inquiry opened by Trent, Mr. Murch for the first time put a question. "Then you left him telephoning by the open window, with the lights on, and the drinks on the table. Is that it?" "That is so, Mr. Murch." The delicacy of the change in Martin's manner when called upon to answer the detective momentarily distracted Trent's appreciative mind, but the big man's next question brought it back to the problem at once. "About those drinks. You say Mr. Manderson often took no whiskey before going to bed. Did he have any that night?" "I could not say.
The room was put to rights in the morning by one of the maids, and the glass washed, I presume, as usual. I know that the decanter was nearly full that evening. I had refilled it a few days before, and I glanced at it when I brought the fresh siphon, just out of habit, to make sure there was a decent-looking amount." The inspector went to the tall corner cupboard and opened it. He took out a decanter of cut glass and set it on the table before Martin. "Was it fuller than that?" he asked quietly. "That's how I found it this morning." The decanter was more than half empty. For the first time Martin's self-possession wavered. He took up the decanter quickly, tilted it before his eyes, and then stared amazedly at the others. He said slowly, "There's not much short of a half bottle gone out of this since I last set eyes on it, and that was Sunday night." "Nobody in the house, I suppose?" suggested Trent discreetly. "Out of the question," replied Martin briefly. Then he added, "I beg pardon, sir, but this is a most extraordinary thing to me. Such a thing never happened in all my experience of Mr. Manderson. As for the women servants, they never touch anything, I can answer for it. And as for me, when I want a drink I can help myself without going to the decanters." He took up the decanter again and aimlessly renewed his observation of the contents, while the inspector eyed him with a look of serene satisfaction, as a master contemplates his handiwork. Trent turned to a fresh page of his notebook and tapped it thoughtfully with his pencil. Then he looked up and said, "I suppose Mr. Manderson had dressed for dinner that night?" "Certainly, sir. He had on a suit with a dress jacket, what he used to refer to as a tuxedo, which he usually wore when dining at home or informally." "And he was dressed like that when you saw him last?" "All but the jacket, sir. When he spent the evening in the library, as usually happened, he would change it for an old shooting jacket after dinner, a light-colored tweed, a little too loud in pattern for English tastes, perhaps. He had it on when I saw him last. It used to hang in its cupboard here." Martin opened the door of it as he spoke, "along with Mr. Manderson's fishing rods and such things, so that he could slip it on after dinner without going upstairs." "Leaving the dinner jacket in the cupboard?" "Yes, sir." "The housemaid used to take it upstairs in the morning." "In the morning," Trent repeated slowly. "And now that we are speaking of the morning, will you tell me exactly what you know about that? I understand that Mr. Manderson was not missed until the body was found, about 10 o'clock." "That is so, sir. Mr. Manderson would never be called, or have anything brought to him in the morning. He occupied a separate bedroom. Usually he would get up about 8 and go round to the bathroom, and he would come down some time before 9. But often he would sleep till 9 or 10 o'clock. Mrs. Manderson was always called at 7. The maid would take in tea to her. Yesterday morning Mrs. Manderson took breakfast about 8 in her sitting room as usual, and everyone supposed that Mr. Manderson was still in bed and asleep when Evans came rushing up to the house with the shocking intelligence." "I see," said Trent. "And now another thing. You say you slipped the lock of the front door before going to bed. Was that all the locking up you did?" "To the front door, sir, yes. I slipped the lock. No more is considered necessary in these parts. But I had locked both the doors at the back, and seen to the fastenings of all the windows on the ground floor. In the morning everything was as I had left it." "As you had left it. Now here is another point, the last, I think. Were the clothes in which the body was found the clothes that Mr. Manderson would naturally have worn that day?" Martin rubbed his chin. "You remind me how surprised I was when I first set eyes on the body, sir. At first I couldn't make out what was unusual about the clothes, and then I saw what it was. The collar was a shape of collar Mr. Manderson never wore except with evening dress. Then I found that he had put on all the same things that he had worn the night before, large-fronted shirt and all, except just the coat and waistcoat and trousers, and the brown shoes and blue tie. As for the suit, it was one of half a dozen he might have worn, but for him to have simply put on all the rest just because they were there, instead of getting out the kind of shirt and things he always wore by day, well, sir, it was unprecedented. It shows, like some other things, what a hurry he must have been in when getting up." "Of course," said Trent. "Well, I think that's all I wanted to know. You have put everything with admirable clearness, Martin. If we want to ask any more questions later on, I suppose you will be somewhere about?" "I shall be at your disposal, sir." Martin bowed and went out quietly. Trent flung himself into the armchair and exhaled a long breath. Martin is a great creature. He is far, far better than a play. There is none like him, none, nor will be when our summers have deceased. Straight, too, not an atom of harm in dear old Martin. Do you know, Murch, you are wrong in suspecting that man." "I never said a word about suspecting him." The inspector was taken aback. "You know, Mr. Trent, he would never have told his story like that if he thought I suspected him." "I dare say he doesn't think so. He is a wonderful creature, a great artist. But in spite of that he is not at all a sensitive type. It has never occurred to his mind that you, Murch, could suspect him, Martin, the complete, the accomplished. But I know it. You must understand, Inspector, that I have made a special study of the psychology of officers of the law. It is a grossly neglected branch of knowledge. They are far more interesting than criminals, and not nearly so easy. All the time I was questioning him I saw handcuffs in your eye. Your lips were mutely framing the syllables of those tremendous words, 'It is my duty to tell you that anything you say now will be taken down and used in evidence against you.' Your manner would have deceived most men, but it could not deceive me." Murch laughed heartily. Trent's nonsense never made any sort of impression on his mind, but he took it as a mark of esteem, which indeed it was, so it never failed to please him. "Well, Mr. Trent," he said, "you're perfectly right. There's no point in denying it. I have got my eye on him. Not that there's anything definite, but you know as well as I do how often servants are mixed up in affairs of this kind. And this man is such a very quiet customer. You remember the case of Lord William Russell's valet, who went in as usual in the morning to draw up the blinds in his master's bedroom, as quiet and starchy as you please, a few hours after he had murdered him in his bed. I've talked to all the women of the house, and I don't believe there's a morsel of harm in one of them. But Martin's not so easy to set aside. I don't like his manner. I believe he's hiding something. If so, I shall find it out." "Cease," said Trent. "Drain not to its dregs the urn of bitter prophecy. Let us get back to facts. Have you, as a matter of evidence, anything at all to bring against Martin's story as he has told it to us?" "Nothing whatever at present. As for his suggestion that Manderson came in by way of the window after leaving Marlowe and the car, that's right enough, I should say. I questioned the servant who swept the room next morning, and she tells me there were gravelly marks near the window, on this plain drugget that goes round the carpet. And there's a footprint in this soft new gravel just outside." The inspector took a folding rule from his pocket, and with it pointed out the traces. "One of the patent shoes Manderson was wearing that night exactly fits that print. You'll find them," he added, "on the top shelf in the bedroom, near the window end. The only patents in the row. The girl who polished them in the morning picked them out for me." Trent bent down and studied the faint marks keenly. "Good," he said. "You have covered a lot of ground, Murch, I must say. That was excellent about the whisky. You made your point finely. I felt inclined to shout encore. It's a thing that I shall have to think over." "I thought you might have fitted it in already," said Mr. Murch. "Come, Mr. Trent, we're only at the beginning of our inquiries, but what do you say to this for a preliminary theory? There's a plan of burglary, say a couple of men in it, and Martin squared. They know where the plate is, and all about the handy little bits of stuff in the drawing room and elsewhere. They watch the house, see Manderson off to bed. Martin comes to shut the window and leaves it ajar accidentally on purpose. They wait till Martin goes to bed at 12:30. Then they just walk into the library and begin to sample the whisky first thing. Now suppose Manderson isn't asleep, and suppose they make a noise opening the window, or however it might be. He hears it, thinks of burglars, gets up very quietly to see if anything's wrong, creeps down on them, perhaps just as they're getting ready for work. They cut and run. He chases them down to the shed and collars one. There's a fight, one of them loses his temper and his head, and makes a swinging job of it. Now, Mr. Trent, pick that to pieces." "Very well," said Trent. "Just to oblige you, Murch, especially as I know you don't believe a word of it. First, no traces of any kind left by your burglar or burglars, and the window found fastened in the morning, according to Martin. Not much force in that, I allow. Next, nobody in the house hears anything of this stampede through the library, nor hears any shout from Manderson either inside the house or outside. Next, Manderson goes down without a word to anybody, though Bunner and Martin are both at hand. Next, did you ever hear in your long experience of a householder getting up in the night to pounce on burglars who dressed himself fully with underclothing, shirt, collar, tie, trousers, waistcoat and coat, socks, hard leather shoes, and who gave the finishing touches to a somewhat dandified toilet by doing his hair and putting on his watch and chain? Personally, I call that overdressing the part. The only decorative detail he seems to have forgotten is his teeth." The inspector leaned forward, thinking, his large hands clasped before him. "No," he said at last, "of course there's no help in that theory. I rather expect we have some way to go before we find out why a man gets up before the servants are awake, dresses himself fully, and is murdered within sight of his house early enough to be cold and stiff by 10 in the morning." Trent shook his head. "We can't build anything on that last consideration. I've gone into the subject with people who know. I shouldn't wonder," he added, "if the traditional notion about loss of temperature and rigor after death had occasionally brought an innocent man to the gallows, or near it. Dr. Stock has them all, I feel sure. Most general practitioners of the older generation have. That Dr. Stock will make an ass of himself at the inquest is almost as certain as that tomorrow's sun will rise. I've seen him. He will say the body must have been dead about so long, because of the degree of coldness and rigor mortis. I can see him nosing it all out in some textbook that was out of date when he was a student. Listen, Murch, and I will tell you some facts which will be a great hindrance to you in your professional career. There are many things that may hasten or retard the cooling of the body. This one was lying in the long dewy grass on the shady side of the shed. As for rigidity, if Manderson died in a struggle, or laboring under sudden emotion, his corpse might stiffen practically instantaneously. There are dozens of cases noted, particularly in cases of injury to the skull, like this one. On the other hand, the stiffening might not have begun until 8 or 10 hours after death. You can't hang anybody on rigor mortis nowadays, Inspector, much as you may resent the limitation. No, what we can say is this. If he had been shot after the hour at which the world begins to get up and go about its business, it would have been heard, and very likely seen too. In fact, we must reason, to begin with at any rate, on the assumption that he wasn't shot at a time when people might be awake. It isn't done in these parts. Put that time at 6:30 a.m. Manderson went up to bed at 11 p.m. and Martin sat up till 12:30. Assuming that he went to sleep at once on turning in, that leaves us something like 6 hours for the crime to be committed in, and that is a long time. But whenever it took place, I wish you would suggest a reason why Manderson, who was a fairly late riser, was up and dressed at or before 6:30, and why neither Martin, who sleeps lightly, nor Bunner, nor his wife heard him moving about or letting himself out of the house. He must have been careful. He must have crept about like a cat. Do you feel, as I do, Murch, about all this, that it is very, very strange and baffling?" "That's how it looks," agreed the inspector. "And now," said Trent, rising to his feet, "I'll leave you to your meditations and take a look at the bedrooms. Perhaps the explanation of all this will suddenly burst upon you while I am poking about up there. But," concluded Trent, in a voice of sudden exasperation, turning round in the doorway, "if you can tell me at any time how under the sun a man who put on all those clothes could forget to put in his teeth, you may kick me from here to the nearest lunatic asylum, and hand me over as an incipient dement." End of Chapter 3. Recording by Kirsten Weber.
Chapter 4 of Trent's Last Case. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Trent's Last Case. Chapter 4. Poking About. There are moments in life, as one might think, when that which is within us, busy about its secret affair, lets escape into consciousness some hint of a fortunate thing ordained. Who does not know what it is to feel at times a wave of unaccountable persuasion that it is about to go well with him? Not the feverish confidence of men in danger of a blow from fate, not the persistent illusion of the optimist, but an unsought conviction, springing up like a bird from the heather, that success is at hand in some great thing or little. The general suddenly knows at dawn that the day will bring him victory. The man on the green suddenly knows that he will put down the long putt. As Trent mounted the stairway outside the library door, he seemed to rise into certainty of achievement. A host of guesses and inferences swarmed apparently unsorted through his mind. A few secret observations that he had made, and which he felt must have significance, still stood unrelated to any plausible theory of the crime, yet as he went up he seemed to know indubitably that light was going to appear. The bedrooms lay on either side of a broad carpeted passage, lighted by a tall end window. It went the length of the house until it ran at right angles into a narrower passage, out of which the servants' rooms opened. Martin's room was the exception. It opened out of a small landing halfway to the upper floor. As Trent passed it he glanced within. A little square room, clean and commonplace. In going up the rest of the stairway he stepped with elaborate precaution against noise, hugging the wall closely and placing each foot with care, but a series of very audible creaks marked his passage. He knew that Manderson's room was the first on the right hand when the bedroom floor was reached, and he went to it at once. He tried the latch and lock, which worked normally, and examined the wards of the key. Then he turned to the room. It was a small apartment, strangely bare. The plutocrat's toilet appointments were of the simplest. All remained just as it had been on the morning of the ghastly discovery in the grounds. The sheets and blankets of the unmade bed lay tumbled over a narrow wooden bedstead, and the sun shone brightly through the window upon them. It gleamed, too, upon the gold parts of the delicate work of dentistry that lay in water in a shallow bowl of glass placed on a small plain table by the bedside. On this also stood a wrought iron candlestick. Some clothing lay untidily over one or two of the rush-bottomed chairs. Various objects on the top of a chest of drawers, which had been used as a dressing-table, lay in such disorder as a hurried man might make. Toilet articles, a book of flies, an empty pocket-book with a burst strap, a pocket compass, and other trifles. Trent looked them over with a questioning eye. He noted also that the occupant of the room had neither washed nor shaved. With his finger he turned over the dental plate in the bowl, and frowned again at its incomprehensible presence. The emptiness and disarray of the little room, flooded by the sunbeams, were producing in Trent a sense of gruesomeness. His fancy called up a picture of a haggard man, dressing himself in careful silence by the first light of dawn, glancing constantly at the inner door behind which his wife slept, his eyes full of some terror. Trent shivered, and, to fix his mind again on actualities, opened two tall cupboards in the wall on either side of the bed. They contained clothing, a large choice of which had evidently been one of the few conditions of comfort for the man who'd slept there. In the matter of shoes also Manderson had allowed himself the advantage of wealth. An extraordinary number of these, treed and carefully kept, was ranged on two long low shelves against the wall. Trent, himself an amateur of good shoe-leather, now turned to them, and glanced over the collection with an appreciative eye. It was to be seen that Manderson had been inclined to pride himself on a rather small and well-formed foot. The shoes were of a distinctive shape, narrow and round-toed, beautifully made. All were evidently from the same last. Suddenly his eyes narrowed themselves over a pair of patent-leather shoes on the upper shelf. These were the shoes of which the inspector had already described the position to him, the shoes worn by Manderson the night before his death. They were a well-worn pair, he saw at once. He saw, too, that they had been very recently polished. Something about the uppers of these shoes had seized his attention. He bent lower and frowned over them, comparing what he saw with the appearance of the neighboring shoes. Then he took them up and examined the line of juncture at the uppers with the soles. As he did this, Trent began unconsciously to whistle faintly and with great precision, an air which Inspector Murch, if he had been present, would have recognized. Most men who have the habit of self-control have also some involuntary trick which tells those who know them that they are suppressing excitement. The inspector had noted that when Trent had picked up a strong scent he whistled faintly a certain melodious passage, though the inspector could not have told you that it was in fact the opening movement of Mendelssohn's Lied ohne Wörter in A major. He turned over the shoes, made some measurements with a marked tape, and looked minutely at the bottoms. On each, in the angle between the heel and the instep, he detected a faint trace of red gravel. Trent placed the shoes on the floor and walked with his hands behind him to the window, out of which, still faintly whistling, he gazed with eyes that saw nothing. Once his lips opened to emit mechanically the Englishman's expletive of sudden enlightenment, and at length he turned to the shelves again and swiftly but carefully examined every one of the shoes there. This done, he took up the garments from the chair, looked them over closely, and replaced them. He turned to the wardrobe cupboards again and hunted through them carefully. The litter on the dressing-table now engaged his attention for the second time. Then he sat down on the empty chair, took his head in his hands, and remained in that attitude, staring at the carpet, for some minutes. He rose at last and opened the inner door leading to Mrs. Manderson's room. It was evident at a glance that the big room had been hurriedly put down from its place as the ladies' bower. All the array of objects that belonged to a woman's dressing-table had been removed. On bed and chairs and smaller tables there were no garments or hats, bags or boxes. No trace remained of the obstinate conspiracy of gloves and veils, handkerchiefs and ribbons, to break the captivity of the drawer. The room was like an unoccupied guest chamber. Yet in every detail of furniture and decoration It spoke of an unconventional but exacting taste. Trent, as his expert eye noted the various perfection of color and form amid which the ill-mated lady dreamed her dreams and thought her loneliest thoughts, knew that she had at least the resources of an artistic nature. His interest in this unknown personality grew stronger, and his brows came down heavily as he thought of the burdens laid upon it, and of the deed of which the history was now shaping itself with more and more of substance before his busy mind. He went first to the tall French window in the middle of the wall that faced the door, and opening it stepped out upon a small balcony with an iron railing. He looked down on a broad stretch of lawn that began immediately beneath him, separated from the house wall only by a narrow flower bed, and stretched away with an abrupt dip at the farther end toward the orchard. The other window opened with a sash above the garden entrance to the library. In the further inside corner of the room was a second door, giving upon the passage, the door by which the maid was wont to come in and her mistress to go out in the morning. Trent, seated on the bed, quickly sketched in his notebook a plan of the room and its neighbor. The bed stood in the angle between the communicating door and the sash window, its head against the wall dividing the room from Manderson's. Trent stared at the pillows. Then he lay down with deliberation on the bed and looked through the open door into the adjoining room. This observation taken, he rose again and proceeded to note on his plan that on either side of the bed was a small table with a cover. Upon that farthest from the door was a graceful electric lamp standard of copper, connected by a free wire with the wall. Trent looked at it thoughtfully, then at the switches connected with the other lights in the room. They were, as usual, on the wall just within the door, and some way out of his reach as he sat on the bed. He rose and satisfied himself that the lights were all in order. Then he turned on his heel, walked quickly into Manderson's room, and rang the bell. "I want your help again, Martin," he said, as the butler presented himself, upright and impassive, in the doorway. "I want you to prevail upon Mrs. Manderson's maid to grant me an interview." "Certainly, sir," said Martin. "What sort of a woman is she? Has she her wits about her?" "She's French, sir," replied Martin succinctly, adding after a pause, "She has not been with us long, sir, but I have formed the impression that the young woman knows as much of the world as is good for her, since you ask me." "You think butter might possibly melt in her mouth, do you?" said Trent. "Well, I am not afraid. I want to put some questions to her." "I will send her up immediately, sir." The butler withdrew, and Trent wandered round the little room with his hands at his back. Sooner than he had expected, a small, neat figure in black appeared quietly before him. The lady's maid, with her large brown eyes, had taken favorable notice of Trent from a window when he had crossed the lawn, and had been hoping desperately that the resolver of mysteries, whose reputation was as great below stairs as elsewhere, would send for her. For one thing, she felt the need to make a scene. Her nerves were overwrought. But her scenes were at a discount with the other domestics, and as for Mr. Murch, he had chilled her into self-control with his official manner. Trent, her glimpse of him had told her, had not the air of a policeman, and at a distance he had appeared sympathique. As she entered the room, however, instinct decided for her that any approach to coquetry would be a mistake, if she sought to make a good impression at the beginning. It was with an air of amiable candor, then, that she said, "Monsieur desire to speak with me?" She added helpfully, "I am called Célestine." "Naturally," said Trent with businesslike calm. "Now, what I want you to tell me, Célestine, is this. When you took tea to your mistress yesterday morning at 7 o'clock, was the door between the two bedrooms, this door here, open?" Célestine became intensely animated in an instant. "Oh, yes," she said, using her favorite English idiom. "The door was open as always, monsieur, and I shut it as always. But it is necessary to explain. Listen. When I enter the room of madame from the other door in there, Ah, but if monsieur will give himself the pain to enter the other room, all explains itself." She tripped across to the door and urged Trent before her into the larger bedroom with a hand on his arm. "See, I enter the room with the tea like this. I approach the bed. Before I come quite near the bed, here is the door to my right hand open, always so. But monsieur can perceive that I see nothing of the room of Monsieur Manderson. The door opens to the bed, not to me who approach from down there. I shut it without seeing in. It is the order. Yesterday it was as ordinary. I see nothing of the next room. Madame, she sleep like an angel. She see nothing. I shut the door, I place the plateau, I open the curtains, I prepare the toilette, I retire. Voilà. Voilà." Celestine paused for breath and spread her hands abroad. Trent, who had followed her movements and gesticulations with deepening gravity, nodded his head. "I see exactly how it was now," he said. "Thank you, Celestine. So Mr. Manderson was supposed to be still in his room while your mistress was getting up and dressing and having breakfast in her boudoir." "Oui, monsieur." "Nobody missed him, in fact. Well, Celestine, I am very much obliged to you." He reopened the door to the outer bedroom. "It is nothing, monsieur," said Celestine, as she crossed the small room. "I hope that monsieur will catch the assassin of Monsieur Manderson, but I not regret him too much," she added with sudden and amazing violence, turning round with her hand on the knob of the outer door. She set her teeth with an audible sound, and the color rose in her small dark face. English departed from her. "Je ne le regrette pas du tout," she cried with a flood of words. "Madame, ah, je me jetterai au feu pour madame, une femme si charmante, si adorable. Mais un homme comme monsieur, maussade, bodeur impassible. Ah non, de ma vie. J'en avais par-dessus la tête de monsieur. Ah vrai, est-ce insupportable, tout de même, qu'il existe des types comme ça. Je vous jure que—" "Finissez ce chaos, Célestine," Trent broke in sharply. Celestine's tirade had brought back the memory of his student days in Paris with a rush. "En voilà une scène. C'est rasant, vous savez. Faut rentrer ça, mademoiselle. Du reste, c'est bien imprudent, croyez-moi. Hang it, have some common sense. If the inspector downstairs heard you saying that kind of thing, you would get into trouble. And don't wave your fists about so much. You might hit something. You seem," he went on more pleasantly, as Celestine grew calmer under his authoritative eye, "to be even more glad than other people that Mr. Manderson is out of the way. I could almost suspect, Celestine, that Mr. Manderson did not take as much notice of you as you thought necessary and right." "À peine s'il m'avait regardé," Celestine answered simply. "Ça c'est un comble," observed Trent. "You are a nice young woman for a small tea party, I don't think. A star upon your birthday burned whose fierce, serene red pulseless planet never yearned in heaven, Celestine. Mademoiselle, I am busy. Bonjour. You certainly are a beauty." Celestine took this as a scarcely expected compliment. The surprise restored her balance. With a sudden flash of her eyes and teeth at Trent over her shoulder, the lady's maid opened the door and swiftly disappeared. Trent, left alone in the little bedroom, relieved his mind with two forcible descriptive terms in Celestine's language, and returned to his problem. He took the pair of shoes which he had already examined and placed them on one of the two chairs in the room, then seated himself on the other opposite to this. With his hands in his pockets, he sat with eyes fixed upon those two dumb witnesses. Now and then he whistled, almost inaudibly, a few bars. It was very still in the room. A subdued twittering came from the trees through the open window. From time to time a breeze rustled in the leaves of the thick creeper about the sill. But the man in the room, his face grown hard and somber now with his thoughts, never moved. So he sat for the space of half an hour. Then he rose quickly to his feet. He replaced the shoes on their shelf with care and stepped out upon the landing. Two bedroom doors faced him on the other side of the passage. He opened that which was immediately opposite, and entered a bedroom by no means austerely tidy. Some sticks and fishing rods stood confusedly in one corner, a pile of books in another. The housemaid's hand had failed to give a look of order to the jumble of heterogeneous objects left on the dressing-table and the mantel-shelf pipes: penknives, pencils, keys, golf balls, old letters, photographs, small boxes, tins, and bottles. 2 fine etchings and some water-color sketches hung on the walls. Leaning against the end of the wardrobe, unhung, were a few framed engravings. A row of shoes and boots was ranged beneath the window. Trent crossed the room and studied them intently. Then he measured some of them with his tape, whistling very softly. This done, he sat on the side of the bed, and his eyes roamed gloomily about the room. The photographs on the mantel-shelf attracted him presently. He rose and examined one representing Marlowe and Manderson on horseback. 2 others were views of famous peaks in the Alps. There was a faded print of 3 youths, one of them unmistakably his acquaintance of the haggard blue eyes, clothed in tatterdemalion soldier's gear of the 16th century. Another was a portrait of a majestic old lady, slightly resembling Marlowe. Trent, mechanically taking a cigarette from an open box on the mantel-shelf, lit it and stared at the photographs. Next he turned his attention to a flat leathern case that lay by the cigarette box. It opened easily. A small and light revolver of beautiful workmanship was disclosed, with a score or so of loose cartridges. On the stock were engraved the initials J.M. A step was heard on the stairs, and as Trent opened the breech and peered into the barrel of the weapon, Inspector Murch appeared at the open door of the room. "I was wondering," he began, and then stopped as he saw what the other was about. His intelligent eyes opened slightly. "Whose is the revolver, Mr. Trent?" he asked in a conversational tone. "Evidently it belongs to the occupant of the room, Mr. Marlowe," replied Trent with similar lightness, pointing to the initials. "I found this lying about on the mantelpiece. It seems a handy little pistol to me. It has been very carefully cleaned, I should say, since the last time it was used, but I know little about firearms." "Well, I know a good deal," rejoined the inspector, taking the revolver from Trent's outstretched hand. "It's a bit of a specialty with me, is firearms, as I think you know, Mr. Trent. But it don't require an expert to tell one thing." He replaced the revolver in its case on the mantel-shelf, took out one of the cartridges, and laid it on the spacious palm of one hand. Then, taking a small object from his waistcoat pocket, he laid it beside the cartridge. It was a little leaden bullet, slightly battered about the nose, and having upon it some bright new scratches. "Is that the one?" Trent murmured as he bent over the inspector's hand. "That's him," replied Mr. Murch, "lodged in the bone at the back of the skull. Dr. Stock got it out within the last hour and handed it to the local officer, who has just sent it on to me. These bright scratches, you see, were made by the doctor's instruments. These other marks were made by the rifling of the barrel. A barrel like this one." He tapped the revolver. "Same make, same caliber." With the pistol in its case between them, Trent and the inspector looked into each other's eyes for some moments. Trent was the first to speak. "This mystery is all wrong," he observed. "It is insanity. The symptoms of mania are very marked. Let us see how we stand. We were not in any doubt, I believe, about Manderson having dispatched Marlowe in the car to Southampton, or about Marlowe having gone, returning late last night, many hours after the murder was committed." "There is no doubt whatever about that," said Mr. Murch, with a slight emphasis on the verb. "And now," pursued Trent, "we are invited by this polished and insinuating firearm to believe the following line of propositions: that Marlowe never went to Southampton, that he returned to the house in the night, that he somehow without waking Mrs. Manderson or anybody else, got Manderson to get up, dress himself, and go out into the grounds, that he then and there shot the said Manderson with his incriminating pistol, that he carefully cleaned said pistol, returned to the house, and again without disturbing anyone, replaced it in its case in a favorable position to be found by the officers of the law, that he then withdrew and spent the rest of the day in hiding with a large motor car, and that he turned up feigning ignorance of the whole affair at what time was it? A little after 9 p.m. The inspector still stared moodily at Trent. "As you say, Mr. Trent, that is the first theory suggested by this find, and it seems wild enough. At least it would do if it didn't fall to pieces at the very start. When the murder was done, Marlowe must have been 50 to 100 miles away. He did go to Southampton." "How do you know?" "I questioned him last night, took down his story. He arrived in Southampton about 6:30 on the Monday morning." "Come off!" exclaimed Trent bitterly. "What do I care about his story? What do you care about his story? I want to know how you know he went to Southampton." Mr. Murch chuckled. "I thought I should take a rise out of you, Mr. Trent," he said. "Well, there's no harm in telling you. After I arrived yesterday evening, as soon as I had got the outlines of the story from Mrs. Manderson and the servants, the first thing I did was to go to the telegraph office and wire to our people in Southampton. Manderson had told his wife when he went to bed that he had changed his mind and sent Marlowe to Southampton to get some important information from someone who was crossing by the next day's boat. It seemed right enough, but you see Marlowe was the only one of the household who wasn't under my hand, so to speak. He didn't return in the car until later in the evening. So before thinking the matter out any further, I wired to Southampton, making certain inquiries. Early this morning I got this reply." He handed a series of telegraph slips to Trent, who read: "Person answering description, in motor answering description, arrived Bedford Hotel here, 6:30 this morning. Gave name Marlowe, left car hotel garage, told attendant car belonged Manderson, had bath and breakfast, went out, heard of later at docks, inquiring for passenger named Harris on Ave boat, inquired repeatedly until boat left at noon, next heard of at hotel where he lunched about 1:15, left soon afterward in car, company's agents inform berth was booked, name Harris, last week, but Harris did not travel by boat. Burke, Inspector." "Simple and satisfactory," observed Mr. Murch, as Trent, after twice reading the message, returned it to him. "His own story, corroborated in every particular. He told me he hung about the dock for half an hour or so, on the chance of Harris turning up late, then strolled back, lunched, and decided to return at once. He sent a wire to Manderson, 'Harris not turned up, missed boat returning Marlow,' which was duly delivered here in the afternoon and placed among the dead man's letters. He motored back at a good rate and arrived dog-tired. When he heard of Manderson's death from Martin, he nearly fainted. What with that and the being without sleep for so long, he was rather a wreck when I came to interview him last night, but he was perfectly coherent." Trent picked up the revolver and twirled the cylinder idly for a few moments. "It was unlucky for Manderson that Marlowe left his pistol and cartridges about so carelessly," he remarked at length, as he put it back in the case. "It was throwing temptation in somebody's way, don't you think?" Mr. Murch shook his head. "There isn't really much to lay hold of about the revolver, when you come to think. That particular make of revolver is common enough in England. It was introduced from the States. Half the people who buy a revolver today for self-defense or mischief provide themselves with that make of that caliber. It is very reliable and easily carried in the hip pocket. There must be thousands of them in the possession of crooks and honest men. For instance," continued the inspector with an air of unconcern, "Manderson himself had one. The double of this. I found it in one of the top drawers of the desk downstairs, and it's in my overcoat pocket now." "Aha! So you were going to keep that little detail to yourself." "I was," said the inspector. "But as you found one revolver, you may as well know about the other. As I say, neither of them may do us any good. The people in the house—" Both men started, and the inspector checked his speech abruptly as the half-closed door of the bedroom was slowly pushed open, and a man stood in the doorway. His eyes turned from the pistol in its open case to the faces of Trent and the inspector. They, who had not heard a sound to herald his entrance, simultaneously looked at his long, narrow feet. He wore rubber-soled tennis shoes. "You must be Mr. Bunner," said Trent. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Of Trent's Last Case. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Trent's Last Case, Chapter 5. Mr. Bunner on the case. "Calvin C. Bunner at your service," amended the newcomer, with a touch of punctilio, as he removed an unlighted cigar from his mouth. He was used to finding Englishmen slow and ceremonious with strangers, and Trent's quick remark plainly disconcerted him a little. "You are Mr. Trent, I expect," he went on. "Mrs. Manderson was telling me a while ago. Captain, good morning." Mr. Murch acknowledged the greeting with a nod. "I was coming up to my room, and I heard a strange voice in here, so I thought I would take a look in." Mr. Bunner laughed easily. "You thought I might have been eavesdropping, perhaps," he said. "No, sir. I heard a word or two about a pistol. This one, I guess. And that's all." Mr. Bunner was a thin, rather short young man, with a shaven, pale, bony, almost girlish face, and large, dark, intelligent eyes. His waving dark hair was parted in the middle. His lips, usually occupied with a cigar, in its absence were always half open with a curious expression as of permanent eagerness. By smoking or chewing a cigar this expression was banished, and Mr. Bunner then looked the consummately cool and sagacious Yankee that he was. Born in Connecticut, he had gone into a broker's office on leaving college, and had attracted the notice of Manderson, whose business with his firm he had often handled. The Colossus had watched him for some time, and at length offered him the post of private secretary. Mr. Bunner was a pattern business man, trustworthy, long-headed, methodical, and accurate. Manderson could have found many men with those virtues, but he engaged Mr. Bunner because he was also swift and secret, and had besides a singular natural instinct in regard to the movements of the stock market. Trent and the American measured one another coolly with their eyes. Both appeared satisfied with what they saw. "I was having it explained to me," said Trent pleasantly, "that my discovery of a pistol that might have shot Manderson does not amount to very much. I am told it is a favorite weapon among your people, and has become quite popular over here." Mr. Bunner stretched out a bony hand and took the pistol from its case. "Yes, sir," he said, handling it with an air of familiarity. "The captain is right. This is what we call out home a little Arthur, and I dare say there are duplicates of it in 100,000 hip pockets this minute. I consider it too light in the hand myself," Mr. Bunner went on, mechanically feeling under the tail of his jacket and producing an ugly-looking weapon. "Feel of that now, Mr. Trent. It's loaded, by the way. Now this little Arthur, Marlowe bought it just before we came over this year, to please the old man. Manderson said it was ridiculous for a man to be without a pistol in the 20th century. So he went out and bought what they offered him, I guess. Never consulted me. Not but what it's a good gun," Mr. Bunner conceded, squinting along the sights. "Marlowe was poor with it at first, but I've coached him some in the last month or so, and he's practiced until he is pretty good.
but he never could get the habit of carrying it around. Why, it's as natural to me as wearing my pants. I have carried one for some years now, because there was always likely to be somebody laying for Manderson. And now," Mr. Bunner concluded sadly, "they got him when I wasn't around. Well, gentlemen, you must excuse me. I'm going into Bishopsbridge. There is a lot to do these days, and I have to send off a bunch of cables big enough to choke a cow." "I must be off too," said Trent. "I have an appointment at the Three Tuns Inn." "Let me give you a lift in the automobile," said Mr. Bunner cordially. "I go right by that joint. Say, Cap, are you coming my way too? No? Then come along, Mr. Trent, and help me get out the car. The chauffeur is out of action, and we have to do most everything ourselves except clean the dirt off her." Still tirelessly talking in this measured drawl, Mr. Bunner led Trent downstairs and through the house to the garage at the back. It stood at a little distance from the house and made a cool retreat from the blaze of the midday sun. Mr. Bunner seemed to be in no hurry to get out to the car. He offered Trent a cigar, which was accepted, and for the first time lit his own. Then he seated himself on the footboard of the car, his thin hands clasped between his knees, and looked keenly at the other. "See here, Mr. Trent," he said after a few moments, "there are some things I can tell you that may be useful to you. I know your record. You are a smart man, and I like dealing with smart men. I don't know if I have that detective sized up right, but he strikes me as a mutt. I would answer any questions he had the gumption to ask me. I have done so, in fact, but I don't feel encouraged to give him any notions of mine without his asking. See?" Trent nodded. "That is a feeling many people have in the presence of our police," he said. "It's the official manner, I suppose, but let me tell you Murch is anything but what you think. He is one of the shrewdest officers in Europe. He is not very quick with his mind, but he is very sure, and his experience is immense. My forte is imagination, but I assure you in police work experience outweighs it by a great deal." "Outweighs nothing," replied Mr. Bunner crisply. "This is no ordinary case, Mr. Trent. I will tell you one reason why. I believe the old man knew there was something coming to him. Another thing, I believe it was something he thought he couldn't dodge." Trent pulled a crate opposite to Mr. Bunner's place on the footboard and seated himself. "This sounds like business," he said. "Tell me your ideas." "I say what I do because of the change in the old man's manner this last few weeks. I dare say you've heard, Mr. Trent, that he was a man who always kept himself well in hand. That was so. I have always considered him the coolest and hardest head in business. That man's calm was just deadly. I never saw anything to beat it. And I knew Manderson as nobody else did. I was with him in the work he really lived for. I guess I knew him a heap better than his wife did, poor woman. I knew him better than Marlowe could. He never saw Manderson in his office when there was a big thing on. I knew him better than any of his friends." "Had he any friends?" interjected Trent. Mr. Bunner glanced at him sharply. "Somebody has been putting you next, I see that," he remarked. "No, properly speaking, I should say not. He had many acquaintances among the big men, people he saw most every day. They would even go yachting or hunting together. But I don't believe there was ever a man that Manderson opened a corner of his heart to. But what I was going to say was this. Some months ago the old man began to get like I never knew him before, gloomy and sullen, just as if he was everlastingly brooding over something bad, something that he couldn't fix. This went on without any break. It was the same downtown as it was up home. He acted just as if there was something lying heavy on his mind. But it wasn't until a few weeks back that his self-restraint began to go. And let me tell you this, Mr. Trent." The American laid his bony claw on the other's knee. "I'm the only man that knows it. With everyone else he would just be morose and dull, but when he was alone with me in his office, or anywhere where we would be working together, If the least little thing went wrong, by George, he would fly off the handle to beat the Dutch. In this library here I have seen him open a letter with something that didn't just suit him in it, and he would rip around and carry on like an Indian, saying he wished he had the man that wrote it here, he wouldn't do a thing to him, and so on, till it was just pitiful. I never saw it change. And here's another thing. For a week before he died, Manderson neglected his work, for the first time in my experience. He wouldn't answer a letter or a cable, though things looked like going all to pieces over there. I supposed that this anxiety of his, whatever it was, had got on to his nerves till they were worn out. Once I advised him to see a doctor, and he told me to go to hell. But nobody saw this side of him but me. If he was having one of these rages in the library here, for example, and Mrs. Manderson would come into the room, he would be all calm and cold again in an instant." "And you put this down to some secret anxiety, a fear that somebody had designs on his life?" asked Trent. The American nodded. "I suppose," Trent resumed, "you had considered the idea of there being something wrong with his mind, a breakdown from overstrain, say? That is the first thought that your account suggests to me. Besides, it is what is always happening to your big business men in America, isn't it? That is the impression one gets from the newspapers." "Don't let them slip you any of that bunk," said Mr. Bunner earnestly. "It's only the ones who have got rich too quick and can't make good who go crazy. Think of all our really big men, the men anywhere near Manderson's size. Did you ever hear of any one of them losing his senses? They don't do it, believe me. I know they say every man has his loco point," Mr. Bunner added reflectively, "but that doesn't mean genuine, sure enough craziness. It just means some personal eccentricity in a man, like hating cats, or my own weakness of not being able to touch any kind of fish food." "Well, what was Manderson's?" "He was full of them, the old man. There was his objection to all the unnecessary fuss and luxury that wealthy people don't kick at much, as a general rule. He didn't have any use for expensive trifles and ornaments. He wouldn't have anybody do little things for him. He hated to have servants tag around after him unless he wanted them. And although Manderson was as careful about his clothes as any man I ever knew, and his shoes, well, sir, the amount of money he spent on shoes was sinful. In spite of that, I tell you, he never had a valet. He never liked to have anybody touch him. All his life nobody ever shaved him." "I've heard something of that," Trent remarked. "Why was it, do you think?" "Well," Mr. Bunner answered slowly, "it was the Manderson habit of mind, I guess, a sort of temper of general suspicion and jealousy. They say his father and grandfather were just the same. Like a dog with a bone, you know, acting as if all the rest of creation was laying for a chance to steal it. He didn't really think the barber would start in to saw his head off. He just felt there was a possibility that he might, and he was taking no risks. Then again, in business, he was always convinced that somebody else was after his bone, which was true enough a good deal of the time, but not all the time. The consequence of that was that the old man was the most cautious and secret worker in the world of finance, and that had a lot to do with his success, too. But that doesn't amount to being a lunatic, Mr. Trent, not by a long way. You ask me if Mr. Manderson was losing his mind before he died. I say I believe he was just worn out with worrying over something, and was losing his nerve." Trent smoked thoughtfully. He wondered how much Mr. Bunner knew of the domestic difficulty in his chief's household, and decided to put out a feeler. "I understand that he had trouble with his wife." "Sure," replied Mr. Bunner. "But do you suppose a thing like that was going to upset Sig Manderson that way? No, sir. He was a sight too big a man to be all broken up by any worry of that kind." Trent looked half incredulously into the eyes of the young man, but behind all their shrewdness and intensity he saw a massive innocence. Mr. Bunner really believed a serious breach between husband and wife would be a minor source of trouble for a big man. "What was the trouble between them?" Trent inquired. "You can search me," Mr. Bunner replied briefly. He puffed at his cigar. "Marlowe and I have often talked about it, and we could never make out a solution." "I had a notion at first," said Mr. Bunner in a lower voice, leaning forward, "that the old man was disappointed and vexed because he had expected a child. But Marlowe told me that the disappointment on that score was the other way around, likely as not. His idea was all right, I guess. He gathered it from something said by Mrs. Manderson's French maid." Trent looked up at him quickly. "Célestine," he said, and his thought was, "So that was what she was getting at." Mr. Bunner misunderstood his glance. "Don't you think I'm giving a man away, Mr. Trent," he said. "Marlowe isn't that kind. Célestine just took a fancy to him because he talks French like a native, and she would always be holding him up for gossip. French servants are quite unlike the English that way. And servant or no servant," added Mr. Bunner with emphasis, "I don't see how a woman could mention such a subject to a man. But the French beat me." He shook his head slowly. "But to come back to what you were telling me just now," Trent said, "you believe that Manderson was going in terror of his life for some time. Who should threaten it? I am quite in the dark." "Terror, I don't know," replied Mr. Bunner meditatively. "Anxiety, if you like, or suspense. That's rather my idea of it. The old man was hard to terrify anyway. And more than that, he wasn't taking any precautions. He was actually avoiding them. It looked more like he was asking for a quick finish. Supposing there's any truth in my idea, why, he would sit in that library window nights, looking out into the dark with his white shirt, just a target for anybody's gun. As for who should threaten his life, well, sir," said Mr. Bunner with a faint smile, "it's certain you have not lived in the States. To take the Pennsylvania coal hold-up alone, there were 30,000 men with women and children to keep who would have jumped at the chance of drilling a hole through the man who fixed it so that they must starve or give in to his terms. 30,000 of the toughest aliens in the country, Mr. Trent. There's a type of desperado you find in that kind of push who has been known to lay for a man for years and kill him when he had forgotten what he did. They have been known to dynamite a man in Idaho who had done them dirt in New Jersey 10 years before. Do you suppose the Atlantic is going to stop them? It takes some sand, I tell you, to be a big business man in our country. No, sir, the old man knew, had always known, that there was a whole crowd of dangerous men scattered up and down the States who had it in for him. My belief is he had somehow got to know that some of them were definitely after him at last. What licks me altogether is why he should have just laid himself open to them the way he did. Why he never tried to dodge, but walked right down into the garden yesterday morning to be shot at." Mr. Bunner ceased to speak, and for a little while both men sat with wrinkled brows, faint blue vapors rising from their cigars. Then Trent rose. "Your theory is quite fresh to me," he said. "It's perfectly rational, and it's only a question of whether it fits all the facts. I mustn't give away what I'm doing for my newspaper, Mr. Bunner, but I will say this. I have already satisfied myself that this was a premeditated crime, and an extraordinarily cunning one at that. I'm deeply obliged to you. We must talk it over again." He looked at his watch. "I have been expected for some time by my friend. Shall we make a move?" 2:00, said Mr. Bunner, consulting his own as he got up from the footboard. 10 a.m. in little old New York. You don't know Wall Street, Mr. Trent. Let's you and I hope we never see anything nearer hell than what's loose in the street this minute. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Kirsten Wever.